Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Rich Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to the first international network of sortition advocates public presentations that we hope will be, as I said, the first in a series of regular informative gatherings for those interested in promoting deliberative processes around the world. For those who are unaware, INSA, as our name suggests, is an international organization with the mission to engage activists from around the world in a conversation about sortition and deliberative democracy, and also to share best practices amongst our members. We also have the hope of being able to spark the growth of new organizations where there are none at this point. We're especially interested in including the voices of non-Western nations and those of the Southern Hemisphere in our conversation, and are actively trying to engage organizations and people in those areas to join us. We do all of this primarily on our Discord server, and you're invited to join us at the Discord invitation that I will include in the chat after I'm speaking. We also we'll have this presentation today recorded so that it's available on our website, which Benny, I think, is going to show now, which is www.insa.site. And that will show up in several days for anybody that would like to listen to it again, or if you want to refer it to anyone else that might be interested. So today we're really honored to feature Ben Redhead as our speaker. As an associate of the Sortition Foundation and co-founder of INSA, Ben brings to the table extensive experience. He's served in roles of strategy consultant, facilitator, project manager, and all of these have really afforded him a unique perspective on the transformative power of sortition. Recently, he launched his own organization, Sorted, an initiative that aims to merge innovations and democracy and organizational development, which is why we're all here today, I assume. Ben's insights aren't just limited to offline platforms. He shares his expertise and observations through his blog, also named Sorted. Ben, I'm going to let you explain how you would like questions presented to you. I assume you would like to have some time to present first, and then we can open it up, but I'll let you decide that. Everybody, welcome Ben Redhead.
Thank you very much for the welcome, Rich. So if we're all good to get the slides up, Benny, and we'll get started from there. Okay, so thanks so much for joining today. It's good to see we've got a good representation of people from different time zones, different interests. So what we're going to be going into today is about the role of sortition in organizations, so often an underexplored dimension of sortition. So in order to introduce this, I'll talk a little bit first about my own sortition journey, primarily starting from the advocacy perspective and why through that experience, I've kind of built into the idea of the importance of sortition in organization in the wider frame of things. After that, I'll outline examples of the use of sortition that are used in organizations based on my own research. And then before touching on opportunities that there are in terms of the growth and the proliferation of these types of practices arising from trends currently in organizations and how sortition can fit alongside that. So just to start off with, so I'll give you a little nod, Benny, how about that for the next slide? So to start off with, just a little bit of a personal story and background. So maybe similar to many of the people on the call here. But again, we all have our own journey to get here. So my story, my sortition story, began about 8 years ago, attending a talk on reinventing democracy. So I was always someone that was politically engaged, but disengaged with party politics. And one of the presenters on their 5-minute carousel mentioned this idea of sortition and, you know, talked about its historical relevance, and not only its historical relevance, but the way that, you know, it could be used in our society and the benefits for that. I'm recommending that if I'm interested and all of this kind of stuff, is check out this book, Against Elections. So I ordered my copy, opened it, devoured it. And really from that point on, it's been the start of a journey where kind of my framing of politics and power has very much been formed within this lens as well. So just the book itself talks a lot about the crisis of legitimacy and also the crisis of efficiency within our current political system, and more to the point, the fault of electoral representative democracy in creating that, as well as the remedy through sortition. So as I mentioned, that's very much been the framing of the starting point, and then it's built on from that point on. So next slide, please. So around this time, I then reached out to Sortition Foundation, local group, keen to get involved. And at this point, around about 2016, 2017, there was a group of us that met on a monthly basis, really just to kind of fantasize about the potential and possibilities of sortition. And just around that time was where we were to see a growth in sortition-based practices, citizens' assembly, a growing acceptance around the world. But before that, there was a conversations, one of the guys that was involved within the conversation, he was talking about, he had this project to write a book. So the book essentially idea is how to get from here to there. And at this point, you know, I was enthusiastic, I was naive, and essentially he convinced me that basically what we need to do is to bring about the political systemic change with sortition, just like all political movements, all good political movements throughout the 20th century. We just need a manifesto to get us there. So we started a journey of, you know, trying to pull together these ideas. What are the convincing points? You know, how can we get people to, this is clearly the best way to do things, right? All we need to do is put forward that convincing case. People will come to their senses and political utopia will be achieved. Of course, you know, that quite quickly stumbled upon the obstruction, and the question, and to the next slide, is about how to bring about systemic change democratically. Of course, you might have a military general who some way does wage war, claim power, and then decides, you know, they're going to defer the power to sortition, to random selection, but it's pretty unlikely. So really the kind of the crux of what we're faced with as advocates of sortition is about how do we bring that systemic change, but from a democratic perspective. And of course, there are hundreds of successful case studies that we can reference, but inevitably we're still a long way off there. And I think it's an important point to make at this stage in terms of defining system change, which is essentially shifting the component parts of a system and the patterns of interaction between these parts, ultimately forming a new system that behaves in a qualitatively different way. So the reason why I provide this definition is because wherever you may fall on the sortition spectrum, you know, whether it's just from a moderate perspective about the importance of embedding participation within the policymaking process alongside elected representative, or to that more radical, you know, full-scale sortition-led structural anarchism, it's still about systemic change. And I think that's really the starting point of where we kind of understanding systemic change. So this slide here outlines the conditions that hold systemic problems in place. So I'm just going to go through this in a little bit more detail. And again, the part of this is explaining, you know, kind of my own journey in understanding kind of sortition, not even great, it's just happening, that how it is actually linked to change and wider advocacy as well. So on the next slide, it talks about the 6 conditions that hold systemic problems in place. So we're starting off here, and for this systemic problem that we're talking about here is the political system that doesn't work and doesn't function properly. So starting off in the middle, we have like talking about practices. So the political system that we have now, particularly in Western democracies, the practices that we're referring to here are primarily elections, and the practices that surround that through the institutions, networks, coalitions are about influencing that practice of election. And again, if we're talking about the changes that we're seeing and trying to implement, it's about different citizens' assemblies. So citizen assembly is a practice itself. So organizations run citizens' assemblies is about, okay, let's create as many citizens' assemblies as possible in my local area. The kind of the next on this same structural level is talking about the policies that are in place and the rules, the laws that kind of guide our actions. And talking about this specific example with regard to sortition in organizations. So the Sortition Foundation, around about 5 years or so, we went through a process of trying to change our membership structure to be sortition based for obvious reasons, right? As we believe that that's the way that, you know, our membership should be defined. But within the UK, if you consider yourself a membership organization to be democratic, you have to have elections in order to have representatives. So again, it's thinking about what policies are in place that hold things together. Of course, and then finally on that structural level is about money, people, information, the resource flows and how they're allocated and distributed. Again, within our political system, that largely goes towards elections. Particularly our friends in the US, you know, if you see the rates of money and investment within elections, it's a massive issue. And then again, if you're talking about providing alternatives, there's a real issue with very few funders relying on small commissioning bodies to find the work. But the key thing is at this top level, a lot of the actions that we're kind of the people that are involved with the sector at the moment is about operating on this space, that structural change. So it's important, but it's also crucial to understanding about that wider systemic change and actually being frustrated by why is it not progressing, right? Well, in order to progress and to be on a lot deeper level, it's about taking it one step below. So taking it on that one step below, talking about relationships, connections, you know, quality of connections, different viewpoints, histories. You know, we've got a lot of good networks, you know, the Democracy R&D network, INSA being another example, but it's about building these spaces and encouraging a plurality through those spaces. The next aspect with the structure is to do with power dynamic. So the distribution of decision-making power and authority. So currently, I mean, for those who are involved in setting up citizens' assemblies, etc., there's a big obstacle really about being reliant on decision-making powers and granting authorities. The high-profile example in Paris, where Macron was all in favor, and you know, this is the new France, listening to the citizens' assembly on climate. But when the radical proposals came forward, it just completely washed them away. So again, it's about understanding how these power dynamics, and then taking it one step below is this whole idea of mental models, habits of thoughts. And I think it's that real understanding that we as advocates, presuming those, or the majority of those in this room are advocates for sortition, is the big obstacle is about deeply held beliefs that people have, you know, and how they contribute to the way how we think, what we do. You know, I'm sure we've all heard the retort about, you know, I don't want my idiot neighbor getting randomly selected, right? So there's a massive challenge there about mental models. And I think the key point here is about how we shift that mindset where elections don't necessarily give us the best leaders. So kind of taking into this model into account, it's really about thinking, therefore, like outside the system to shift the system itself. So the contributions that we have aren't just operating on the practice level, is taking it all into account. And so moving then onto how this links to organizations more widely, I think it's important to recognize and remember that the political system is not an isolated system itself. You know, it's part of a wider socio-economic system. And much like the political system, the system of work, the way that we operate, suffers from outdated models of working. So you can link that similarly to the emergence of Western democracies in the early 20th century, late 19th century. Similar time is where the time where the advent of industrialization, and around this time when the first large organizations and entities were being formed and being understood and being put together, this what's referred to as the Taylorist model. So it's essentially the science of management. You know, and a lot of those kind of issues with regards to standardization, division of labor, seeing people as a machine, creating hierarchies as well. And we're seeing a lot of these issues, which I imagine to a large extent are kind of reflected of your own experiences of work, certainly mine. And then again, it's thinking about those political systems that we have within work. So for example, I work at large universities, and the way that there is accountability within the university, when we talk about kind of empowerment, where you talk about listening to voice, is talking about, we're having town halls, you know, where it's still the same dichotomy of a leader and then the people they're trying to convince them that they're doing the right thing, or having consultations, which are largely tick box exercises, or, you know, voting a representative, who speaks on my right as well. And again, I think it's important to not just see the political issues that we have in isolation, and thinking about how that is a wider kind of outdated model within society, and linking back to the point by Van Rayburg in his book, this idea of a failure of legitimacy and efficiency. And then, of course, this largely reflected my professional experience as well. So working in charities, working in social enterprises, working in public institutions, as well as with corporate organizations, even in like strategic delivery roles, facilitator roles, still being really kind of constricted by a lot of these essentially structures that are in place, and ways of thinking and relationship dynamics. So a lot to take in there, and I've kind of like I've condensed it all together. Sorry, Benny, we missed a slide when I was talking about that. So essentially just outlining the 85%, and, you know, there's a wider issue within work. And then on to the next slide. So this then brings us back to that kind of systems change model, and how, you know, we get from here to there, and kind of almost like that question that I first posed to myself 8 years ago. This is at least a little bit of a recognition or a visual representation of how we get from there to there. So essentially that link between sortition and organization, because if we think about it in the scheme of all possible decision-making bodies, you know, in a small amount of countries, particularly on a global scale, and in a small percentage of local authorities within these countries, and then in a tiny range of organizational settings within these local authorities, within these countries, where there are examples of deliberative practices. So definitely, you know, we're at this very early adopter stage, and it's really about how we can demonstrate and put forward as many and different examples. And again, linking it back to that model of that structural model. So the more examples there are, and increasing examples of applicability, you know, that changes the way that we think about the practices, the policy, the resources on the structural level. You know, the more that we kind of widen examples of distributed decision-making authority, that's linked to that relational change, you know, that it's commonplace that, hey, darling, I've just been invited to my work, you know, committee on, I've been randomly selected to contribute to our decisions, right? That kind of thing gets normalized. And then on the third level, you know, the more that we're introducing that concept from all possible decision-making bodies, the more that it does become normalized. And this whole aspect, you know, this strange aspect of random selection in order for decision-making bodies, thinking back to that mental model and those kind of blocks and where those mental models are, you know, can start to open some space towards that. So that's the kind of altogether journey, and it certainly didn't happen in a linear way. You've got the highlights of me trying to condense all of these experience of going back forwards, round and round and round in a circle. And this is my effort to try and put it into a few slides. But essentially, on the next slide, please, this had kind of led me with, based on my own kind of experience, is to think about, okay, what can I do then, you know, as well as all of the other things that we go, what can I do? And it's about the idea of setting my own organization up. And I think the kind of crucial thing to say at this stage, this isn't an organizational pitch, right? You know, at the end, it's about finding people that are also interested. But I recognize that my goal is just to use this as a mechanism to Sortition for that system change, if I'm honest. So yeah, that just to be really transparent on that point as well. However, finding that, the kind of had that as a starting point, and then that really led me to kind of researching, okay, fine, well, where do we start then? Okay, where the first way do we start is finding out where it's used in organizations at the moment. So will take me on to the second part. So Benny, if you will. Before we do that, just for the purposes of clarity, so when we're talking about sortition here, we're talking about sortition is a random representative sample used to select a group. So there are, of course, different methods to do this, but you know, the basic overall summary is the removal of bias from the selection, whether unconscious, predetermined, or self-selecting. And generally speaking, this would be a two-step process. Now, I suppose the reason why I would advocate for a two-step process is unless you can kind of mandate participation, for example, in the UK, sortition by jury, a jury selection, you have to attend. Therefore, you could argue that, you know, one-step process isn't as necessary, but certainly where there's a scope for people to basically reply based on their own availability, or, you know, from a demographic they're likely to participate, it's really important to have that two-step process. So on to the next slide, please. Additionally, just before, so primarily the focus here is on random selection linked to participation and deliberation. But of course, during this, there were some interesting examples that I came across from an historical basis, and that's to use sortition or random selection to select people to be involved in positions of power. So, for example, historically, the University of Basel, that's how they selected their professors in order to involve corruption regarding this. The Coptic Church, again, appointing the Pope, chief magistrate in medieval Venice. And yeah, interestingly, this article that I've highlighted there, it talks about what the recommendations were. And essentially is saying that partly random selection, so not random selection because there's the competency threshold, greatly reduced the self-importance of leaders. They were less prone to misusing their power to decisions that were more beneficial to other members of the group. So I thought that was an interesting little side. And to be fair, if we're talking about, you know, building in institutional models of sortition, it would be great to kind of think about how this leadership selection aspects interacts. But generally, my kind of focus was around the wider link between participation and deliberation. So on to the next slide, please. So the first kind of examples that we're referring to is, so sortition is the most familiar really. So it'd be using sortition to interact with the public. So the example that we've got here, well, this picture represents, so it was in the late 90s within Texas. So it's a deliberative polling method, which was commissioned by 8 utility companies, which had revealed a strong public preference for renewables and energy efficiency. So the next one also, if you just click through, please, Benny. And then there are another few examples of this, of utility companies using this model, a lot more recent in the UK, 2022, Rethinking Water within the UK and Electricity Future. Also, just to say at this point, if people actually are aware and recognize or are familiar with other examples, this has become a bit of my pet project to collate them. So please do drop them in the chat And I'll be curious if we do have a discussion at the end to kind of explore them in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. Again, we're seeing usually it's again using that citizens assembly methodology. Recently, just in November 2023, there was a museum in Germany, answering the question of how can museums become more democratic, aim to reassess the significance of cultural institutions in terms of their role in society. So on to the next slide. So generally speaking, as I said, these are essentially using a citizens assembly model, and the benefits that we can see and why I would advocate them used more widely is, first of all, is the increased democratic legitimacy. So I've worked a lot with public sector institutions, and often there is a legal requirement to engage with the public. So within those circles, rather than engagement and public engagement just being a tick box exercise, there's a strong case to be made, that we can increase that democratic legitimacy. We can make sure that participation is better and we can get better engagement. So for example, referring back to the first example of the Texas deliberative polling. So Texas certainly know a beacon of progressive kind of ideas, not as a result of this kind of process in the late 90s. They saw unexpected bipartisan support for US wind power, and now Texas now leads the way in US wind power. So it is an example of how using these approaches within public facing institutions, interacting with the public, it does really offer up an opportunity for transformative proposals. And I really see there's an opportunity to use this with anywhere with a legal requirement for public consultation, healthcare, housing, transport, a whole range of different public facing administrations, even when we talked about museum, cultural institutions. Again, feel free, if there are other ones that kind of come to mind, maybe ones that you work in or interact with, please drop them in the chat as well. I do want to touch on one point though, and this is based on my own experience, is thinking about the use of deliberative processes beyond just the remit of citizens' assemblies, and just kind of reminding ourselves that citizens' assembly are a specific methodology and a specific way of doing things, incorporating these processes. If we're talking about public consultation, the barrier to going from a focus group to a citizens' assembly, from cost measures, time, all of that organizational perspective, is a big leap. However, if we're talking about focus groups, to making sure that those focus groups are diverse by using sortition, and making sure that those focus groups are more deliberative and more engaging rather than just, one-way conversations, that's an opportunity to do that. And I know that there are models out there, whether it's from a jury perspective, and it's a thinking about not just going from here to there with an assembly, because putting that pitch forward can be a difficult thing to do, but thinking about the steps in between there. On to the next slide. So this kind of next point, I'm referring to basically using sortition to increase representation. So if you could click through. So in this case, within education, so when I'm kind of referring, this little section is referring to communities. So thinking about communities beyond, where we live and kind of defined by a political boundary, but thinking about the community, about other kind of organizational settings that we might frequent. So fantastic example to start off with is Democracy in Practice. So it's an organization that, working with schools in Bolivia, I think we're pleased to have one of the people that was involved in that project on this call, is about using random selection sortition to select school representatives. So that's one example. If to click through to the next one, and another example, so at London School of Economics, they recently ran a democracy summit within the student union, which was about, which is essentially, again, it's a deliberative process using sortition, and some of the recommendations that they were able to put forward was about the way that they consult with the student public more generally is to actually embed deliberative and sortition-like processes. And there are a few examples, not many, if I'm honest, regarding student unions across the UK and Germany. They're the only examples that I've found so far. But again, it's about the student union is how we can better represent the people that we claim to. On to the next slide, please. So then the next aspect, kind of taking in this idea of a community being a framing of people, united under an organizational goal, is about using sortition for governance. So our very own Democracy Without Elections, did what the Sortition Foundation were legally not able to do as a membership organization, is using sortition to elect their board, essentially. So again, at the end of this call, if people that are involved in that project would like to kind of give some more detail, please do. But just as a brief overview, is from the membership, is doing random selection from the membership and stratifying from gender within that. And what did a small membership group have in common with the French military? Well, the use of sortition for governance. So an interesting little case study. So the High Council of the Military Function since 1968 in France has been using sortition in order to introduce for their process, largely to avoid the kind of issues, the politicking that we might find with elections. So to summarize those points onto the next slide, it's about, so firstly, within these kind of community-based settings, what are the benefits? Again, there's that point of democratic legitimacy linked to that point within the French military, that it's a process that is much more suited to not having politicking. And for anyone that's been involved in a community organization or my mum's allotment committee, that those elections can get highly contested and political, right? So there's an opportunity there as well. I think the second point here is the opportunity to extend representation and opportunity to participate. So certainly within the democracy in practice example within the schools in Bolivia, there's a great podcast actually, which one of the people involved with Malcolm Gladwell talking about this, and this whole idea of often, political events within schools and education setting are largely popularity contests, but it offered an opportunity to kind of build beyond that, to get different voices in the room. And then the final point here is leading to better engagement. So speaking with the experience of Democracy Without Elections, running sortition from a governance perspective has enabled more engagement with the membership that you would generally find, and that even though people might come to the end of their term on the board, their likelihood to participate in the activities is higher as well. So I think generally speaking, on this second point about opportunities, so the way that I see it, there's opportunities for any organization which has an established community to experiment with these ideas. There's enough promising examples out there. There's enough kind of convincing cases out there. If we're talking about trade unions, again, educational institutions, cooperatives, kind of one of my fantasy ones is sports teams, having supporters that are around a certain, they have a shared interest, a shared community, how you can embed these participatory deliberative practices, right? And any sort of membership organization. So then the third aspect, if I could click through, please, Benny, is thinking about organizations using deliberative engagement internally. Now, this was the kind of my area of focus initially. And for the last 3 years or so, it's been kind of my own little treasure hunt of trying to kind of find these examples out, because if I'm honest, there's not many. And ultimately, this has kind of links me back to the kind of the key focus of Sorted, where there is the most underutilized potential in my view. And I think that's not just in regards to potential use cases, but also many of the obstacles that we have with running sortition processes, such as dropout rates, such as engagement rates, such as response rates within an organizational setting. These can be overcome very easily based on the assumption that you've already got a captive audience. You've already got people that by hook or by crook will attend things that their employers are supporting. So as I mentioned, I've been on my own little treasure hunt, and there are a few examples which I'll go over now, but please do send me some others if you have found them. So the first one, if you click through, is a process that is called the Wisdom Council. So this was developed by US consultant Jin Ruff, and this kind of model is not just used in organizations, but it's also used within the state of Vorarlberg in Austria. And it translates, so the way that it, like Bulgarat, I think, apologies for my terrible German, but that essentially translates as citizens' councils. So that does happen. And this is, if we're talking about recognition of processes, participatory processes, this is one of them. But it's also a process that has been used within organizations as well. So the paper that I was referring to talks about it's being used in a variety of different organizations, which unfortunately didn't give too much detail. I think there was a data sharing agreement there, a bank, a paper mill, a manufacturing branch, and also one example which you can find on YouTube and which I've screenshotted here, Swisscom. So the way that a Wisdom Council works, so the first stage is, you'll be pleased to hear, a random selection process. So for their random selection process is using kind of like a Wheel of Fortune wheel. And I mean, that did actually get me thinking about how within an organizational setting, the importance of kind of making it performative and making it kind of a thing that's like interesting, like everyone that's got a lottery ticket kind of thing can get involved with. But once those 12 people in this case were randomly selected, drawing your attention to the photo on the bottom right. So through a facilitation method called dynamic facilitation, the people that are involved will end up coming up with proposals. And the facilitation method is really about kind of finding that deep resonance with the group. Generally speaking, I like this kind of model and style of facilitation. I suppose the kind of the core obstacles really at the moment is because it is a method that relies heavily on highly trained facilitators, because it is a tough task. Highly trained facilitators that I have kind of question marks about its viability as well. But what we're essentially seeing here, so when it's happening in Germany, and some examples who the person that found it, Jim Ruff, is essentially it's consultants who use this process. So it's again thinking about people that do have that involvement. It's about giving them a toolkit which involves sortition and then building it out from there. Onto the next slide, please. So now the next one that I found, the nicheness of this will really, the nicheness of this will really kind of put to mind how difficult it is to be finding these examples.
Slides are one behind, I think. What we're seeing, I think, is one slide behind.
Benny, any load? There we are. Good stuff. So it is the innovative approach to employee involvement. So this was Sodexo, which is an extremely large logistic firm which works all over the world. I don't know how I came across this one, but a Sodexo branch in Oslo, Norway, ran what they claimed to be the world's first employee panel. And I found this an interesting one purely because I'm quite shocked that this is the only one I have been able to find so far, which is using a deliberative approach. But also, if you kind of read the overview on it, and then talking about, so it's essentially they have 15 people, largely representative, use of Sortition, speaking about strategy discussions, and then the comments from the people that took part. So for example, they talked about how good it was for colleagues to meet and talk together, showing that there's always, and again, people that have been involved with Citizens Assembly, there's always that feedback that people just enjoy having space and room to talk, that it'll be interesting to see. There were many good suggestions that came up. It'll be exciting to see any of them put to good use. Again, something that comes up, and it is about that legitimacy of the process. And then the last quote that I found, again, aligns with it is, more such gatherings were requested by many participants, including myself. So again, it signs, and anyone that has been involved within a deliberative participatory process, always people are saying that they want more of it, right? So I have absolutely no idea why there hasn't been more, and this was just a kind of an isolated approach. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is to kind of not make this the world's first employee panel and the last one, right? And just to really increase that approach. On to the next slide, please. So there's also an interesting thing this is recently emerging. So Meta, so the artist formerly known as Facebook, have recently actually run a massive deliberative engagement project internally. So this was initially about the metaverse and creating the metaverse, and it said it involved over 6,000 people who were chosen to be demographically representative across 32 countries and 19 languages. And although there's not necessarily Sortition that was used, again, it shows the kind of these massive organizations that are kind of open to innovative ideas, particularly understanding the kind of human potential within that, using to these processes and ideas. And interestingly, the feedback was 82% of the participants said that they would recommend this format as a way for the company to make decisions. And as a result of that, Meta publicly committed to running a similar process for generative AI. And then if those who are involved in or have been kept an eye on the AI deliberative democracy space, a lot of other organizations such as OpenAI, DeepMind have been exploring approaches using deliberative democracy. So it will be interesting to see how that develops. Now, I think the key aspect here with regards to why this has happened, my best guess is that there is kind of an individual influence. There is people that are involved quite heavily within the AI sector and also in the deliberative democracy sector who are directly advocating and vouching for this as a positive way. So it was the person that wrote this article. His name was Aviv Ovaida. Apologies, Aviv, for your butchering your name there. But essentially is filling those spaces and advocating for direct approaches within these spaces. So next slide, please. So then that brings us to the question of how we get from here to there. And the fact that there's only these few examples that over a few years of kind of exploring and researching there are. And largely it's how do we put that case across that Sortition is not just something that is relevant in the format, but it is something that, do you know what, we welcome this approach and putting a convincing case across. And so for this, so I'm outlining some existing trends in businesses which align with Sortition as a complementary tool. And these are things that have traction, they have a large understanding, and it'd be interesting to see how we can position Sortition alongside these. So the first one on the next slide is this concept of cognitive diversity. So there's a big trend within organization about utilizing the potential of cognitive diversity. So this has actually been outlined quite well by one of the prominent Sortition academics, Helene Landemore. She's got an article on it, but a great read on this principle is this book here, Rebel Ideas. And essentially kind of to quote it, is that research shows that individuals and teams with diverse thinking and a variety of experience, expertise, and opinion are much better equipped to deal with complex problems and have higher levels of collective intelligence as well. So we're seeing on a societal-wide level that there is a real interest in increasing diversity within organizations. Now, of course, a large part of that is about representation, through employment and promotion, and making sure in response to political movements that we have broad representation as well. But I think the core thing to remember is that if those kind of decisions are being made, those policies are being put in place without really linking that to the full benefits of diversity from an outcomes perspective. So with cognitive diversity, there's accusations that then it's largely tokenistic as well. So cognitive diversity really, and how we link that to sortition. So it's about sortition. It allows to remove that self-selecting mindset. So by definition, sortition doesn't follow a pattern of sociability and networks. So therefore, that's rectangle, which is the available knowledge needed to solve a problem. We have a broad spectrum of it, rather than that management team, which is similar degrees, similar life experiences, similar roles. Although individually their circles might be large, collectively they don't have that coverage of which a sortition-like process could provide. In addition to that, the stratification element could ensure that representation is something that's put in place. And we have seen this. There's an initiative called Boardroom 2030, which again, not explicitly talking about sortition, essentially advocates the boardroom of the future is involving diverse views and viewpoints. There's also an idea of youth boards. So L'Oreal, for example, sets up a youth board, which is basically an advisory to the general board about how they can start thinking about different ways of thinking that are more in tune to the youth. Now, again, it's about putting forward sortition as an example of a way to achieve cognitive diversity. And if that's understood, introducing that as a concept which can be adopted as well. So next slide, please. So the other relevant aspect is to do with collaborative change management processes and the empowerment link that they have. So generally, change management is about senior management with the help of external agencies trying to implement change. So consultation then really becomes about removing barriers. So they may run focus groups, they may run workshops, but that input is about justifying what's already been decided rather than shaping the change. Now we're seeing a shift with consultancy firms starting to embrace a more collaborative approach, much more aligned with the deliberative model. So favoring a diversity of contributions, participation, transparency. And again, not explicitly using sortition nor deliberation, the kind of concepts of it are there. So people that run these processes in a democratic sense, by definition, understand what's needed within a change management collaboration sense in order to achieve the same outcomes as well. Unfortunately, I'm not able to name them publicly, but I spoke with a consultant that runs these processes in order for changing operating models. So one example they gave of a large consequential government organization, and I'll just give an example. So usually the hard part of change is the people, as it's quoted there. And he gave me an example of a middle manager who had a direct role in redesigning their departments and roll out of existence. And usually that kind of approach is met with redundancy discussions, redeployment discussions, etc. However, by involving that manager within the process, through the workshops, they were selected to contribute. That middle manager was not actually an obstacle to change, they were one of the main advocates, because they understood the vision, they understood the future, and they understood their role within it. And again, it's about, there's a real link to empowerment as well. These types of processes are a collective learning opportunity. So knowledge sharing, cross-functional teams, these are all the kind of terminology that are used within organizational settings. And essentially providing these opportunities through an assembly-like space, through a deliberative space, will help build that organizational culture. So these, again, that's a second kind of thing that's convincing as part of it. The next one, so for those that have worked in the corporate sector, will be very familiar with the term. So it's agile. And what started life as a project management methodology about bringing software to the market faster has evolved into an organizational philosophy, which is about essentially adopting a flexible approach and kind of move to an organizational reality based around human knowledge rather than the kind of linear industrial model as well. So that general shift towards distributed decision making as well. So agile is $1 billion industry. Every organization, every corporation are trying to kind of apply agile. Every consultancy firm are trying to put forward their approach for agile as well. So it's kind of understanding that the need for collaborative processes, the need for flatter organizational structures is there. And it's thinking about how to put forward sortition as a way of clarifying that sense of purpose and bringing that whole together to ensure that, you know, these processes are normalized, not just on a functional level, but from a wider organizational level as well. So the next one that we have here, creativity and innovation as well. So again, something that is wildly and largely used across different organizational settings is design thinking. And again, a lot of this terminology will be very familiar. You know, design thinking, the way that it's advocated and the why that people use it is because of the way that it solves complex problems. Again, where have we heard that before as well? What's the reason why it solves these complex problems is because it reframes in the human-centric way and it finds out what's actually most important to the people. Okay, so again, a lot of this terminology, there's a lot of overlap. Additionally, with design thinking, the setup of design thinking is this whole idea of being diverse and empowered. The groups are diverse and empowered as well. So as points that I've previously made, there's a real opportunity for sortition to be positioned alongside here, you know, possibly engaging with the public, within teams, etc. So the last slide here, and what you often find within the organizational setting. So yeah, the next slide, please, Benji, is about, so a lot of these agile approaches, design thinking approaches, flatter organizational structures are often kind of pulled together under this term human-centered organization. And there's a really interesting report written by IBM kind of outlining this, talking about the organizational model moving away from that Taylorist approach that I referred to at the beginning, about creating better human experiences, about caring for the experience of diverse, empowered teams, actively embedded these principles into the fabric of their organization. So there's a widely understood framework that this is how companies, successful companies, should operate. And if we're talking about from a metrics perspective, you know, leads to higher revenue, higher on the S&P 500, you know, deliver outcomes to market, etc. There's that aspect of it. But there's also the key core aspect is about, you know, there is a demand for human-centered solutions, you know, so there is a demand to be more human-centered. There's a demand to create further understanding, to create more value to users, welfare employees, essentially by building that resilience of the organization. So the challenge here really is that demand exists, and where do we position sortition where we recognize that it's it can provide cognitive diversity, it can support collaboration, it can make empowered decisions, etc. How do we position Sortition as a tool under that wider human-centered organizational umbrella? And if we are able to do that, like, my view is that the possibilities, I mean, if we link back to that first slide of, you know, the moving towards the paradigm which is widely accepted, that give us a chance to get there. So the last slide, please. Yeah, so that's all from me. It went on a little longer than I expected, so I apologize. Hopefully we'll have some time to squeeze in some questions, but for those that do have to show up, I really appreciate the time listening. Largely at this point, you know, true to the name, I'm just keen to find anyone that's wants to kind of join this journey, to talk about it, to think about solutions, to talk about potential, etc. So please reach out. So I've got my email address there. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm active on LinkedIn. There's not too many Ben Redheads in the world, so you can find me there. But I've also got a QR code for you there. So hopefully we have some time for some questions, or if there anything that has popped up.
Ben, Emil will ask a question. How large would a group or organization need to be for the benefits of sortition to kick in? Are we talking about dozens, hundreds, more?
Yeah, good question. I think that there's not, you know, I wouldn't want to, essentially there isn't a determined number at this moment in time. Generally, in this kind of instance, I would be kind of prone to using the Dunbar number. So which is this whole kind of concept of 150 is the number of which beyond that, you don't build that human relationships as well. But it'd be very interesting to see if there are examples or even academics that are keen to explore that. I suppose with the Wisdom Council, you know, there were less than 100 people, and I think the key core aspect is about scale. So like the smaller the scale of the organization, you know, the smaller the scale of the process, etc.
I have a question about how power differentials would be handled. You know, say you have an organization that is fairly hierarchical with a lot of different subgroups. You want representation across the system, and also you need to sort of control for the reality that there's people who are maybe in the same room as a manager or somebody who has power over them. How have you seen that addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to caveat all of these questions is that this, you know, is an introduction, and a lot of these questions remain unanswered. So I suppose I will give my kind of initial views on it, but I would say that, you know, this is something that will be explored. So I think what you see and kind of what I tried to put across about these human-centered organizations is there does have to be an understanding of, there has to be essentially a want to explore these kind of processes and to be collaborative, etc. I think a lot of it, in the same what we're seeing from a democratic perspective, is that at the moment the power lies with the leadership. So we do actually rely on the leadership to grant legitimacy. So to grant legitimacy to these processes. And I think without that, doing it on a self-organizing perspective will be quite difficult to do, particularly how it's linked to power. So it's really about getting buy-in initially from the leaders, kind of determine like what the organizational infrastructure is. And then it's about, you know, linking that to the purpose of using these processes. The way that I see it, the benefit is that even if teams are operating in a self-organizing manner, there's not often mechanisms to bring that whole. Whereas Sortition, based on its scalability, does allow that. Hopefully that's kind of opened a few lines of inquiry at least.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think, that's why I kind of wanted to, there's that links to that structural issues at the time. There's legal issues there, there's mental models issues there. There's people that are understanding with it as well. So I think really at this stage, it's about experimenting. There's not going to be one approach that works. It's about trying that diversity of approaches and, finding the possibilities for examples there.
To go a bit further on Benny's question, how many people do you need to be able to make sortition worthwhile? And my experiences with Democracy Out elections, running a number of selections there for our board. If you don't use stratification, I think the minimum number is 2. You just draw one and then that's it. Now that's ridiculous from where we are, but I think that's your baseline. If you want to stratify on one selection, I'm guessing 100 will do it based on our experiences, but going to 2 and 3 and 4, et cetera, it just grows exponentially. I don't think it's a linear model.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
If I can just jump there on that, it really depends on the task you're giving them. If they're deliberating and trying to do one-on-one conversations and figure things out, there is a limit on how big it can be. But if, let's say, there's a proposed constitutional amendment, you could have 1,000 people who don't meet in person, hearing all the pro and con arguments and then voting, sortition selected that's truly representative. In that case, they're not deliberating back and forth. They're absorbing information and voting. So it depends completely on the size of the population you're drawing from, the size of the body, and the function, the task you have for them. Not all sortition needs to be deliberative. Some might be judging the performance of a chief executive or something else.
On that same note, I think, like, especially if you're selling sortition to an organization, you have to sell it as a solution to a problem. And so in terms of can we make it work, then yes, you only need 2. But if you're like, okay, why can't we just all decide this on one, like, Slack thread or whatever? Like, if you're going to sell it to the organization, it needs to be a solution to a problem. And so there's a kind of a minimum number of sort of below which you can just hash it out directly, depending on the structure of the company.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really, really important point. And I suppose the final slides is when I was talking about the creative, innovative, collaborative, empowered, and certainly my approach moving forward will be that, solving a problem. There is a need to operate more collaboratively. There's a need to, employees don't feel invested or empowered as well. So yeah, that's a really good point. Brilliant. I'm going to take that as a idea that there isn't any more questions, and I appreciate people have had to drop